Good morning, everyone. The hearing will come to order. Welcome to the Committee on the Budget's hearing on oversight of the Congressional Budget Office. This hearing will focus on CBO's organizational and operational structure. It is the first of 5 hearings that the committee plans to hold regarding oversight of the congressional budget. The goal of today's hearing is to learn more about CBO, which was created as part of the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974. For decades, this agency's primary duty and function has been to assist Congress in the federal budget-making process by providing cost estimates, economic analysis, working papers, and other insightful publications. Members of the House and Senate Budget Committees rely on CBO as an objective, impartial resource when writing budget resolutions. The agency also plays a key role in advising this committee as it enforces budget rules. Without question, there are dozens of fine men and women employed by CBO, including analysts, management, and support staff. But more than 40 years since its founding, Congress has not undertaken a comprehensive review of CBO's structure and processes. In fact, CBO still operates under its original permanent authorization. I say this not to raise alarm about the future of CBO or question Congress's need for it. It's simply a fact that serious oversight has not been exercised to ensure the agency still has the tools it needs to be successful in fulfilling its mandate. That being said, our intention is the same with today's hearing as it will be with upcoming hearings. We want to better understand how CBO carries out its nonpartisan mission in service and support to Congress. During today's hearing, we will take a closer look at the organizational and operational structure of CBO, including its staffing, assumptions, processes, and work products. To provide an overview on the inner workings of this congressional support agency and how it has evolved over the years, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Keith Hall. Dr. Hall has served as director of CBO since April of 2015, when he became the 9th director of the agency. Before we hear directly from Dr. Hall, I want to stress again that this series of hearings is not designed to be partisan or to invite cheap shots against the agency so vital to Congress's ability to budget independently. However, there are legitimate questions about how CBO operates, and I'm hopeful that these hearings will shed light on how we can improve its operations to provide Congress what it needs in the 21st century. To ensure CBO can effectively and efficiently carry out its mission, I'm pleased we are advancing a comprehensive review through these oversight hearings, and I look forward to productive conversations today with Dr. Hall. Now, before I yield to my colleague, the Budget Committee's ranking member, Mr. Yarmuth, I'll remind everyone that this committee will strictly enforce the 5-minute rule. I'm a military guy. I like to run a tight ship, and I want to ensure that our hearings are as productive as possible. So I will ask that your remarks and your questions are delivered with enough time for our witness to respond. If they are not, answers will be submitted for the record, and I will hold my colleagues and myself to this rule. So thanks in advance. I look forward to a productive hearing, and now would like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Yarmuth, from the great Commonwealth of Kentucky, for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your new role. I look forward to working with you. And thank you for calling this hearing. All of us on the Budget Committee take our oversight role seriously, and I am very glad that we will be discussing these important issues today. I hope that we will be just as diligent in our responsibilities to develop a budget proposal, and we'll hear testimony from the federal agencies that we expect to be significantly impacted by the President's budget. Director Hall, thank you for your testimony in advance, and thank you for your service. Congress created the Congressional Budget Office to give us an independent and reliable source of budgetary information and expertise. For more than 40 years, CBO has fulfilled its mission, providing impartial, high-quality analysis to inform our decision-making and improve our ability to protect the power of the purse. While everyone here is aware that Director Hall was appointed by congressional Republicans, expectations have always been that the CBO director will carry out his or her responsibilities without allegiance or deference to any political ideology or party. Same is true of the staff, who are hired based on their ability and qualifications, not political affiliation. As a result, CBO produces its best analysis regardless of any desired outcome for an administration, the majority in Congress, or the congressional minority. Despite that commitment to objectivity, however, CBO has been the target of criticism, and I'm sure we will hear some of that today. You've actually heard some of it from me over the years. Director Hall, I do not envy you. You have what I would argue is one of the most thankless jobs in Washington, and that is to be our objective referee. And coming from a basketball state, I know how loved the referees are. In an arena where passions run deep, your calls will often be embraced by one side while questioned by the other. One day it's the Republicans complaining, the next it's Democrats. That has been a reality in Congress since CBO's inception. But there's been a dramatic shift recently in the treatment of CBO, and as members of the committee, this should be deeply troubling to us all. Questioning and fair criticism of CBO have morphed into more caustic attacks. Many have crossed the line, and much of this friction seems to center on analysis of my Republican colleagues' efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Look, I get it. I would not want to defend increasing the number of uninsured Americans by 20 million or causing premiums to skyrocket, particularly when there's no viable plan for replacement. But I'm not sure what you thought CBO's analysis would show. The Affordable Care Act expanded coverage through three related strategies: requiring insurance companies to make meaningful coverage available to all, requiring individuals to get covered, and subsidizing premiums to make coverage affordable. If you end the individual mandate, which we've just done, people will go without coverage. If you end subsidies that help families afford insurance, people lose coverage. If you take away consumer protections and once again allow insurers to play games, premiums will increase for everyone who is not in perfect health, and people lose coverage. There's no way around the fact that repealing the Affordable Care Act will result in millions of American families losing health coverage, and there's no way to defend that to the American people. So, with nowhere to turn, many of my Republican colleagues unfairly went after the CBO, inappropriately impugning the integrity of the agency and the staff. I want to be clear. I think Congress has every right, even a duty, to review CBO's work and ask questions, and CBO needs to be forthcoming in providing explanations. Democrats have certainly raised questions about assumptions or interpretations, but what we haven't done is called into question the integrity of the institution or individual staff members. It's all too easy these days to take refuge in information that tells us only what we want to hear, but that does not lead to sound policy. CBO does not exist to give us the information we want to hear. Its job is to give us the information we need to make informed, responsible decisions. It's one of the few institutions in Washington that serves that role. Attacks on the CBO aren't just attacks on Director Hall and his staff. They are attacks on our integrity as a deliberative body. They reduce trust in government and undermine the standards on which a functioning democracy depends. Today, I hope to hear from you, Dr. Hall, about how you ensure your work is objective and the steps you've taken to increase transparency at CBO. I'd like to learn more about your expert staff, technical capabilities, and about any need for additional funding or tools. You'll likely hear from us disagreements with some of your methodologies. I think some will challenge you on the process and will encourage you to look at alternative methods. I think that's all fair game, and I look forward to that discussion. Thank you again, Dr. Hall, for your leadership at CBO and for testifying today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, I would ask that they be submitted for the record. I'd like to now introduce and recognize the Director of the Congressional Budget Office, Dr. Keith Hall. Dr. Hall, thank you for your time today, and let me just say from a personal standpoint how enjoyable it was yesterday to visit the fourth floor of the Ford building and the great staff work that's taking place over there with the Congressional Budget Office under your leadership. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You have 10 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and the floor is yours. Thank you, sir.
Chairman Womack, Ranking Member Yarmouth, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify this morning about CBO's organization and operations. And thank you for your support and guidance. We at CBO have long relied on the budget committees to explain our role to others in Congress. We also rely on you to provide constructive feedback and guidance on Congress's priorities. The work on your part has been key to our success over the years. I would like to make 10 points in my remarks, and then I look forward to talking with you about how we can serve Congress better. First, lawmakers created CBO to give the Congress a stronger role in budget matters. CBO was established under the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 to provide objective, nonpartisan information that would support the budget process. CBO's mission is to help the Congress make effective budget and economic policy. In carrying out that mission, the agency offers an alternative to the information provided by the Office of Management and Budget in the executive branch. Second, the Congress sets CBO's priorities. CBO follows processes specified in statute or developed by the agency in concert with the budget committees and congressional leadership. CBO's chief responsibility under the Budget Act is to help the budget committees with matters under their jurisdiction. The agency also supports other committees, particularly the Appropriations, Ways and Means, and Finance committees and leadership. Among CBO's statutory requirements is producing certain reports, the best known of which is the Annual Budget and Economic Outlook. That report includes CBO's baseline budgetary and economic projections. CBO is also required by law to produce a formal cost estimate for nearly every bill that is approved by a full committee of either House or Senate. Those cost estimates are only advisory. They can but do not have to be used to enforce budgetary rules or targets. Moreover, CBO does not enforce such budgetary rules. The budget committees do. Third, CBO produces a lot of work each year. For example, last year the agency published 740 formal cost estimates, provided technical assistance to congressional staff as they developed literally thousands of legislative proposals and amendments, and published many reports about the budget, the economy, and related issues. Nevertheless, because of limited resources, the number of estimates and analyses that CBO can produce falls short of congressional requests. Moreover, we must balance our commitment to respond quickly to the Congress with our professional responsibility to release estimates and analysis only when their quality is high enough. Fourth, in order to provide Congress with the high-quality analysis that it needs, CBO's staff has expertise in many areas. Among CBO's roughly 235 people, the largest concentration of expertise is in the area of health. Other areas of focus include national security, labor, taxes, energy, and macroeconomics. Maintaining a broad array of expertise allows CBO to respond to policymakers' needs quickly. Analysts are organized into a number of divisions, but much of CBO's work requires work from more than one division. CBO analysts always pursue high quality and accuracy. They approach issues with a detailed understanding of federal programs and the tax code. They carefully and critically read the relevant research literature. They painstakingly analyze data collected by the government, statistical agencies, and by private organizations. And they regularly consult with a diverse range of outside experts, including professors, analysts at think tanks, representatives of industry groups, other private sector experts, and government employees at the federal, state, and local levels. Some of the consultations occur during periodic meetings with CBO's panel of economic advisors and panel of health advisors. Fifth, CBO's analysis is objective, impartial, and nonpartisan. We maintain our objectivity in a number of ways. One is that we make no policy recommendations. Another is that we hire people on the basis of their expertise. Nearly 80% of CBO's employees have advanced degrees, and without regard to political affiliation. We carefully consider whether potential analysts can perform objective analysis regardless of their own personal views, and we enforce strict rules to prevent employees from having financial conflicts of interest and to limit their political activities. We aim to reflect the full range of experts' views as we present the likely consequences of proposals being considered by the Congress. Our estimates are inherently uncertain, but our goal is to produce estimates that are in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes. Sixth, models do not produce CBO estimates, CBO does. CBO's estimates often require projections of how people and institutions would respond to proposed changes in law. A computer model is one tool that analysts may use to make such a projection. There are various kinds of models, such as complex simulation models, regression models, and calculations in spreadsheets. CBO's models are constantly being enriched and improved. Nonetheless, models often cannot show the full scope of the effects of a legislative proposal. Analysts must routinely go further, combining what can be learned from a model with other information so that the estimates correspond as closely as possible to what the best available research suggests. Seventh, CBO has a rigorous system of checks and balances. All of CBO's cost estimates and reports are reviewed internally for objectivity, analytical soundness, and clarity. That process involves many people at various levels in the agency. Analyst consultations with outside experts help them hear all perspectives on an issue. And we continually revisit our past work and learn from the differences between our projections and actual outcomes. We also compare our analysis to others' work and incorporate outside feedback into our projects. Eighth, CBO prioritizes transparency. Since its inception, the agency has used many approaches to be transparent. To begin with, CBO's cost estimates and publications include documentation of the basis of their findings. In addition, we document the revisions to our budget projections and estimates. We report on the accuracy of our projections, including our projections about the economy, spending, revenues, and health insurance subsidies. We publish analyses of how sensitive our estimates are to key parameters, and we seek external review of our reports before they are released and of the methods in which our products are based. CBO also promotes transparency by providing broad access. When CBO completes a formal cost estimate, it is made immediately available to all members of Congress, their staff, and the public on CBO's website. Furthermore, CBO's analysts regularly explain their analysis to Congressional staff. For instance, earlier this month, in collaboration with the Congressional Research Service, my colleagues gave a presentation to 150 Congressional staff members about how CBO develops estimates of health insurance costs and coverage. Unfortunately, the pace of Congressional action sometimes limits the time available for providing extensive explanation of estimates. And because the overall demand for CBO's work is high and our resources are constrained, we need to balance requests to explain more about finished analyses with requests for new analysis and with our other responsibilities, such as regularly updating our baseline projections. Ninth, CBO evolves as the needs of Congress evolve. Though CBO has remained true to its original mission, we work with the Congress in ways probably not envisioned when the agency was first created. For example, as legislation has grown more complex, we have found ourselves spending more time providing preliminary analysis and technical assistance during the drafting stage. And we're being asked more often to prepare cost estimates for bills that are heading for votes without being marked up by committees first. To accommodate the Congress's needs and agenda, CBO shifts staffing and develops new analytical tools. For example, we developed significant resources to strengthen our ability to analyze healthcare issues so that we would be prepared for large-scale legislative proposals on that front. Similarly, we improved our capability to study how legislative proposals would affect the economy and thus the budget as the Congress's desire for dynamic analysis intensifies. 10th, CBO is always looking for ways to do things better. For example, we are reviewing and updating every aspect of our simulation model of health insurance coverage, which forms the backbone of our budget projections related to federal health care spending for people younger than 65. In addition, we will further improve our capability to perform dynamic analysis as well as our ability to analyze how changes in federal regulations affect the economy and the budget. Responsiveness and transparency are top priorities of mine, and CBO has plans to bolster them further. The agency will make greater use of team approaches to handling surges in demand for analysis of particular issues. We will increase the public documentation of our computer models. We will also do more to explain how analysts employ models while producing estimates. The extent to which CBO can accomplish these objectives will depend partly on whether we receive the funding we have requested for them. As always, we look for ways to serve you better. I welcome your suggestions.
Thank you, Dr. Hall, for your opening remarks. Look forward to the questions. The chair expects to be here for the entire duration of the hearing, and as such, I am going to defer my time until later in the sequence of Q&A. So I will be yielding first to our members, who I know are on a tough time clock today because of the number of things that have been crammed into one day and the fact that the Republican retreat begins tomorrow. So I will withhold my questions at the present moment and use those as we clean up the hearing at the end. Now I'll yield to my friend, the ranking member from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I intend to do the same thing. I'll sit to the bitter end with you. Thanks.
For the first round of questions, I go to my friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking you for this hearing. I think this is something I know my good friend, the former chairman, was planning to do as well, but it's really important for us to do. And I want to begin, Dr. Hall, by thanking you and your staff. I've dealt with a lot of different CBO directors since I've been on this committee and with the staff, and it's been unfailingly professional and courteous no matter who was at the head of it. So I think you had a very fine agency. I don't always agree, but I've never had any difficulty getting the explanations and the judgments, and that's fair enough. I do want to ask a couple of things, and my good friend from Kentucky talked about the Affordable Care analysis, and there is one area that I want to ask about, and it's sort of down in the weeds, and then I want to build on that and ask you how you come to assumptions and models and what kind of input, if any, Congress has as you build your predictions on a series of assumptions and models. As I recall, and I think I've mentioned this to you before when you were kind enough to come by my office, in the model that was used, there was an assumption that non-Medicaid expansion states would all become Medicaid expansion states, and therefore people would get insurance, and therefore they would lose insurance later on down. I quibble with that just because, and I'm not basing this on a policy argument either way. I mean, I'm not arguing for or against the Affordable Health Care Act. I can just tell you politically, in my state, that's just not going to happen. There was no way it was ever going to become a Medicaid expansion state. The population was heavily opposed. It just politically was not feasible. And frankly, the state didn't have the money even for a 10% match at the time. So, there are literally in that model of how many people would lose insurance, a bunch of people that don't have it now in the state of Oklahoma would not get it because you would not have the Medicaid expansion, so therefore couldn't lose it. So walk me through how you make those kind of assumptions. And then as you're doing that, if you would, because I think when you make assumptions like that, sometimes it would be helpful to, and maybe you do this, just talk to the committee itself, both sides of the aisle, and say, okay, this is what we're doing. Do you have a problem with this, or do you think there's some fault in this or something else we should be thinking about? We shouldn't be making the final decision, you should, but just a way in which you got more input back and forth between members and the institution which is here to serve them.
Well, thank you for that question. That was actually a tricky part of the ACA for us, because initially all states were required to expand. So our initial estimates had 50 states expanding. Then when that was overturned, we of course didn't anticipate that. So we're now into an area where we now have to sort of predict how many states will voluntarily expand and won't expand. Now, we've never been so extreme that we think all the states are going to expand. I think right now we anticipate that enough states right now have expanded that's covering about 50% of the population that could potentially be eligible. We see it going up to about 70%. So it's not so extreme where we go from 50% to all the states will take it. So it's much lower than that. And that's a tricky thing, because what we've done is we've looked at states, looked at their past behavior, looked at a number of things, how they've taken federal money in the past, and sort of put them into categories, buckets, if you will. And then from those buckets, we assign some probability with each bucket that they will expand at some point over the next 10 years. So part of what that means then is we've tried, although we've put states in the buckets, a state A could actually be in a different bucket in reality, and state B could be moved back to that other bucket in reality. So there is uncertainty in that. And we've tried not to focus too much on the individual states. Once we have states categorized, we then calculate the population in those three buckets and put some probabilities on that.
Well, I'm not going to ask an additional question. My time's limited here, but please tell us who made these decisions, and is there any political dimension to this? I mean, literally, I think in a lot of these states, the members on both sides of the aisle give you a pretty good opinion. Again, reserving for you to make the final decision on, it's your estimate after all.
Well, first of all, we spent some time at deciding what are the different things that could influence whether a state expands or not. We had a large number of sort of dimensions under which we did that. and use that to sort of, I say, sort of put them in the buckets. Now we worked that up with consultation with folks. I had a briefing talking about how that was done, that sort of thing. We did not, I don't know exactly who we wound up talking with. We probably talked with some state insurance companies.
I don't want to be the first guy the chairman chastises for running over time.
Okay.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and we'll visit about this again. But thank you very much.
Ms. Lee of California.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our ranking member for this hearing. And also thank you, Director Hall, for being with us today. Today's hearing gives us an opportunity to really discuss how important CBO's impartial analysis is to Congress and to the American people. And I'd like to reiterate the fact that Congress created CBO so we could have clear guidance on budgetary matters to inform our work here and for the public, and it was not created so Republicans or Democrats could smear the organization's impartial and nonpartisan analysis just because we don't like Cbo scores. Last year, Director Hall and our ranking member mentioned the ACA. It's a fact that Republicans spent weeks attacking your organization's score of their, quite frankly, terrible ACA repeal bill. They found it ridiculous when Speaker Ryan jammed through an updated repeal bill without a score in May. And that upon your analysis, though, it would reduce health care coverage by $32 million while increasing premiums for older Americans by as much as 850%. So can you just explain how your organization comes up with just the basic analysis of how many people will go uninsured, how you came up with that, and what else do you need from us in order to ensure that that these attacks no longer happen? What is it you think we could do to make sure that your job can be accomplished without the partisan attacks?
Well, I'll start with the last question first briefly, is things like the oversight hearings are really helpful to us. I'd love the chance to talk about things. And one of the things I wish we were able to do more is come to visit individuals' offices and make little presentations on things. I've never turned that down, but I think in hindsight I'd have pushed into offices more when somebody has an issue to come in and talk about where we got the numbers and what we were thinking. On the ACA repeal, there are various versions of that, but there were some things that were kind of clear, right? There were aspects of it that were essentially reducing subsidies for people, things that were to reduce the expansion of Medicaid, that would eliminate the mandate. So those are all things that are going to work to lower the coverage relative to our baseline. I mean, even just saying those things without modeling it, I think you're talking about a decline of probably tens of millions of people from coverage without the modeling. And with our modeling, we spent a lot of time doing this very, very carefully, very different aspects of it. And our best estimate, I think on the final bill, was something like 23 million person decline in coverage overall. But it involved a very long process. There were a lot of steps to it. We used the famous healthcare simulation model. That was just a piece of it. We had to create several other models. We had to use models looking at the interaction with Medicare. We had to use a tax model, the Joint Committee on Taxation. So it was a very complicated process. I can't do it justice here, but we did make a presentation that I mentioned at the Congressional Research Service, going through exactly what we did to get to that estimate. I can make those notes available to you, and we can think about doing another presentation if folks want to.
So do you think that it's the process that appeared flawed by those who attacked this, or do you think it was the outcome of your analysis that was not liked?
Yeah, I can't guess. I think the numbers were very large for folks. I personally am not sure they should have expected anything but pretty large numbers. But we certainly can try to do better in explaining what we've done.
Okay, and also, I have a few more minutes. I just want to ask you about the Trump administration and their criticism of the CBO. I remember they indicated their budget would kick off a 3% growth and end the deficit within 10 years, and CBO found that it would do no such thing. instead of, I think it was boosting growth. Instead, I think you came up with 1.8% or 1.9%. So what is it, again, is it the process or is it the outcome of your analysis that the administration also believes was not accurate?
Well, I don't know that much about how they did their economic forecasting. They haven't provided a lot of information on it. But certainly this is part of the value, I think, of CBO. We did our own independent analysis. We did our own forecast on the economy. We looked at a lot of data. We're very, very careful about that. And when we publish our budget outlook, we have a lot of detail in there about how we get to our economic forecast and how that economic forecast affects our budget forecast. So we're very transparent about that.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearing today. You've got your work cut out for you, Mr. Chairman. I'm reading from today's Washington Post. They say if you're already bored with State of the Union coverage, tune in this morning for what we're dubbing Republicans versus the Congressional Budget Office. It's hard to see how we get from where we are to where we want to be. I thought my friend from California accurately expressed her frustration about partisan attacks on the budget office, and then went in to use the budget CBO data to make partisan attacks on bills. And I think that's a challenge. When I go back and look at the 74 Act, I think you said in your opening statement, Director, the CBO was created to give Congress a stronger role. I think what was actually true is the Budget Committee was created to give Congress a stronger role, and the CBO was corrected to advise and counsel the Budget Committee. In fact, under the original legislation, you were to be the staff of the Budget Committee, joint shared staff between the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. Isn't that the original incarnation of the CBO?
Yeah, I'm not sure about what the original intent was, but certainly that characterization is right, that we're here only to assist the budget committees and the rest of Congress. Yeah.
My reading of history tells me the Senate found it beneath them to share a staff with the House Budget Committee, and so once they insisted on having their own staff, we insisted on having our own staff, and you were left to advise us both there on the side. My experience, you talk about hiring people irrespective of political outlook, and I think that's very challenging to do. My experience with CBO directors is I tend to learn more about their politics after they're gone than while they're there. We see a lot in hindsight, but I look at, I'm reading from a CBO cost estimate of the American Health Care Act, and the top line says this: CBO and JCT estimate that enacting the American Health Care Act would reduce federal deficits by $119 billion over the coming decade and increase the number of people who are uninsured by 23 million in 2026 relative to current law.
Yes.
What you could have said is that we're going to increase health care freedom for we estimate that enacting the American Health Care Act would reduce federal deficits by $119 billion over the coming decade and increase the number of people who are uninsured by 23 million in 2026 relative to current law.
Yes.
What you could have said is that we're going to increase health care freedom for 12 million people between now and 2026 relative to current law. You could have said we're going to expand the choices that the American people have and repeal the mandates in their life. Every single sentence has a political flavor to it. Has a you rightly describe your role as scorekeeper, but because words have meaning, every single line takes on a political connotation. How do we scrub to prevent that? And specifically, for example, did folks talk about describing the Affordable Care Act, the American Health Care Act, in health care freedom terms instead of people lose insurance because they decide it's not right for them and so they leave it on their own volition?
Well, first, I respectfully disagree that our language at all was political. And one of the things that we tried very, very hard to do was to be very factual about this.
Well, let me interrupt you because my time is limited, because that's critically important. The top line says Americans lose something. The fact is Americans have the right to choose something new. They lose nothing. They make new choices. And if you don't recognize that line as being political, then we have a much harder challenge. If you recognize that just by nature of words having meaning, they will be political, someone will take those and use them politically, then it may not have been your intent, but at least we recognize the outcome of that.
I say we did not use language like lose. We talked about how the number of people with coverage would change over time relative to the baseline. I think part of what happens is we have no control over how the press reads our work and interprets it and translates it. And I think sometimes some of the language that people use in describing it is not really our language, and it gets attributed to us. We tried very hard. This was a document written for members of Congress. We have lots of detail in there about where that change in coverage.
Those are the winds of change blowing here, Director. You make a very interesting observation. CBO was in fact created to advise Congress, and I would expect that you probably get more attention from outside of Congress than you do from inside of Congress these days. And though we won't have time to do it in this hearing, I look forward to having that conversation. I think Congress could benefit more from your work if it was less the object of political conversation, more policy.
Right. Well, let me just say one thing about that it was a conscious decision. When we put out these estimates, while the debate was going on, I got so many offers. We got so many offers to go appear on TV and talk about things. We deliberately chose to let our report speak for itself and not be, that would be like interviewing the referee at halftime, right? We made our estimate, we did our best to describe it, and then it was up to you all to deal with the politics and the decisions about it. Again, that to me is very consistent with the idea that we're just providing advice. We're not trying to get attention at all, except by you, because we want to help you make good decisions.
Mr. Moulton from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director, for being here. I appreciate your presence and your work. You know, I'm reminded of when I lost my dog, whom I loved very much, and people expressed their condolences, and I said, oh, no, I just have the freedom from my dog. And that's how I looked at it. Can you tell me, what are some of the transparency initiatives that you have taken to better understand, to help the public better understand your work? I mean, you've admitted that this is a place where you could do better to help Congress and the public understand your analysis. So what are some of the things you're working on?
Sure. Well, we've always relied upon trying to write up our estimates as clearly as we possibly can with as much detail as we possibly can. And we've always counted on being able to come in and talk to members if they have questions and that sort of thing. Lately, we're hearing concern over transparency. We're trying very hard to increase transparency, and we're doing it really in a number of ways. You know, there's been a lot of talk about the health insurance coverage model, where we're completely revising that. We're going to be making presentations about different aspects of that publicly so we get feedback on it, and we're going to provide documentation, and we're going to provide some computer code. That's a big lift, and it's actually, we've been planning on doing this since I came on board 3 years ago. We've been too busy doing healthcare estimates. We'd hoped to be done literally a year ago, but we've been too busy doing healthcare estimates and having to do that with the old model to take the time to sort of update things and try to be more transparent. That would help, I presume, a bit for people to understand where we get our healthcare estimates. Although, we've also made some presentations. We're trying to document our processes. We're increasing that. We're trying to document our models more. We're doing things like our long-term budget model. We're redoing parts of that. We're going to make that publicly available. And
Director, what kind of formal review does CBO's work undergo? Do you consult outside experts? How do you decide whom to consult? Right. What are some of the ways that you check your work?
Well, part of what we do is we train people very carefully that they need to go out and get information from various different sources with different points of view, and people who have some understanding not only how legislation would work, but how it would be implemented. So we do that very carefully with training, and then once we get that done, we try very carefully to rely on all the data we found and make a general, have a general opinion on how things are going to work. We have a very careful review process. Almost everything we produce, well, everything we produce is reviewed at several different levels. For big things, we have a huge number of people involved. For the healthcare estimates, we probably had 24 people involved. So a lot of it is getting a lot of viewpoints inside CBO, but also trying to get a variety of viewpoints outside CBO.
Are there analytical tools that you lack that you would like to have? Are there places where you feel like you could improve the robustness of your analysis if you had access to more materials or more resources?
Certainly with the analytical tools, the answer is yes, always. Because we have so many models, we're always trying to update them. They always need to be adapted. To give you some idea of the range of work that we've got, we did a count of our models, and not just the models that exist, but the models that we use over and over and over again. We got up to about 215 different models, and we're constantly updating those things. So this gives you an idea of the challenge that we have, right, in sort of keeping these things up to date. We have a lot of people doing that, and it's also a challenge for the transparency part, because it takes time to make these things publicly available.
Jared, my final question is about a relatively new challenge you face, which is all this outside criticism of CBO. As anyone who's led a team knows, morale is important, and morale affects the quality of work. Has the morale of your team suffered as a result of these attacks, and how do you see that affecting your work going forward?
I think our morale's held up pretty well because I think we have people who are professionals, and they expect that people criticizing the analysis or disagreeing with analysis, that's fair game. We do have some trouble when people call us biased or something like that, which is going just too far, because we're actually trying very, very hard to do our work carefully. I think for the most part people understand, and we've had quite a few people come to our defense. People who actually know CBO's work and use CBO's work carefully have really come to our defense on some of these criticisms.
Thank you.
That's been very helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Gary Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get away from the partisan jabs and get to issues that I think all of us ought to take very seriously. And one of them is your report 2017, the long-term budget outlook. And you pointed out that this about obviously a year ago that debt to GDP was currently about 77%. Is that where we are?
Yes.
And you also pointed out that in 30 years, debt to GDP will be 150%.
Yes.
And for anybody who's still awake at this point watching this, I just want to point out that that means our debt will be approximately half again bigger than our entire economy. Is that correct?
That's right.
Is that a serious problem?
It is a serious problem. It's a serious issue that it's not getting better.
Would you suggest that this committee ought to be taking a very serious look at how we scale that back instead of talking about what we did last year or year before last?
Well, I want to be careful about making recommendations to the committee, but we're
you put out the
prepared to help
report.
Support that work.
You put out the report, and it's a serious report, and I assume you're planning to release another long-term budget outlook in a month or two. Would that be fair?
That's fair.
Okay. What are your? You're obviously looking at the numbers now. I don't know if you can speak to that, but roughly. What would we need to do in the next budget to get us on track to get us back to the historic 50-year average for debt to GDP, which I think is about 40%? Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, we actually have some of those scenarios in our budget outlook that will be coming up. We actually do have some scenarios about sort of what it would take if you start now and that sort of thing. I don't know those off the top of my head, but
it's
we
about
do try
$680 to $700 billion, I think, isn't it?
Okay, you've read the last one. That sounds right.
Yeah. So my point, Mr. Chairman, is that since you are now the chairman of the Budget Committee, we have some serious work to do if we want to get our fiscal house in order. And it's going to require that we make some tough decisions in regard to budget, particularly mandatory spending, and that would include health care. Also, I want to ask you, in your last report, that we were looking at, I think you were projecting economic growth at 1.9%. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, the long-term economic growth would settle in at 1.8.
What's long-term, 10 years, or are you saying averaging 1.9 over 10?
I think we'd settle into it, that's right, in before 10 years, 7 or 8 years, and then going forward it would remain at about that level.
So are you optimistic or pessimistic that that number might improve?
Well, I think part of what I'd like to do is point out the sort of things that would be needed for that to improve.
What would that be?
Well, it would be supply side things. It would be the capability of the economy to increase production past its sort of potential. So, the obvious things are the biggest single problem we have is a slowly growing labor supply because of the aging population.
Well, I was going to try to get to that. I appreciate you preemptively bringing that up because I think that's, again, part of the work that we've got to do in the Budget Committee in regard to making sure that the able-bodied are in the workforce and that we then take a look at what we might need to do in regard to bringing in other people to work. I've only got a little over a minute left, and I want to change directions just a little bit here and ask you, I appreciate the work you're doing towards trying to enhance a culture of transparency at the CBO. In addition to those efforts that you've listed, has there been any discussion of including some sensitivity analysis with estimates so that members can see how small changes in assumptions could drastically impact the estimate?
Yeah, I'm a fan of that, and we do that certainly in the reports where we have more time, like the Outlook. That can be really hard to do in cost estimates where there's a real time constraint. And then sometimes there are these so-called unknown unknowns, where there's some statistical uncertainty, but there's some just uncertainty. We just don't know what it is.
Is this because of limited bandwidth or insufficient tools? I mean, limited bandwidth for the staff? I mean, what do you need? Because if we're going to start talking about how we resolve the longer-term issues 30 years down the road, these minor changes that could make big differences will matter a lot to this committee.
Sure. Well, to be honest, that's one of the reasons why we have a fair number of technical economists who are there to sort of help us work through some of this methodology and develop some ways to be more transparent on things like the uncertainty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Ms. Del Benny from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Hall, for being here with us and for your time. Before coming to Congress, I was a businesswoman, and I also ran the Washington State Department of Revenue, and I know that an organization can't move forward if they only have limited visibility. A business wouldn't stay in business if it only planned 30 or 60 days at a time. Yet here we are, 4 months into the fiscal year, and have passed 4 continuing resolutions. Would you agree that this very short-term approach to budgeting undermines the budget process and introduces unnecessary uncertainty into government programs and agencies?
Well, I appreciate the question, but I want to try to back off on offering advice to the Budget Committee beyond the sort of the technical work that we do. It's part of how we establish our objectivity. Well,
does this uncertainty make it harder for you to provide long-term budget projections?
Sure. I mean, it poses challenges. I spent some time as the head of a federal agency, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the budget challenges there from not knowing the budget was not trivial.
And what about your own ability to plan for this year and hire staff?
That's an issue for us. We had some extra expenses last year, and right now our continuing resolution is not what it needs to be. And if we were to continue at this continuing resolution for the rest of the year, we'd actually have to cut back on staff and in training and some things like that would make it very difficult for us.
Thank you. Also, my district is a district on the northern border in Washington State. It is a very politically diverse district, yet everyone seems to agree that we need to pass comprehensive immigration reform. We have farmers, a business community, faith-based community, across law enforcement, across the board, want to see comprehensive immigration reform. And in your prepared testimony, you mentioned that the CBO will publish new reports in 2018 describing your processes for producing economic forecasts for major legislation affecting health insurance. I wonder, do you plan to do the same for any major legislation affecting immigration?
Well, if we have specific proposals, we'll do our thing and estimate the likely impact
So in 2013, CBO released a report on the economic impact of comprehensive immigration reform. That report said that the cost estimate shows that changes in direct spending and revenues under the legislation would decrease the federal budget deficits by $197 billion over the 2014 to 2023 period, and by roughly $700 billion over the 2024 to 2033 period. Folks are talking about debt and deficit, and so as there are several proposals for immigration reform in both houses of Congress at the moment, are there any key takeaways from your 2013 analysis and modeling that will be helpful for members to know as we work to craft a new immigration bill?
I think you got the main takeaway is fine. I don't recall too many specifics at this point, but obviously immigration reform really depends upon a lot of the specifics. That's one of the things that we're very, very careful about is that sometimes the details matter when you don't think they matter. That makes a big difference. And we rely on research literature, what the most current research literature is that talks about the effect of immigration on labor force and certain things like that.
Well, clearly there's a lot of work that went in from the CBO in the past on this issue, and it has shown that it would decrease the budget deficits, and obviously would have is an important part of the conversation when we're looking at a tax bill that just passed that would increase our debt and deficit by over $1.5 trillion. So I think this is an important conversation. I want to emphasize that the Congressional Budget Office is nonpartisan office, and it is tasked with objectively looking at the facts. And so I want to thank you for your work, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Delbene. Mr. Renacci from Ohio, the witness is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to congratulate you on your selection. I look forward to working with you in 2018. I appreciate this hearing. I hope we can also go back and look at budget reform, our budget committee reform that we did a few years back, and look at some of those issues as well over the coming year. I want to thank you, Director Hall, for being here. I appreciate you coming to my office, I know, a few months ago and talking about how you can be more transparent. We talked about my career. I mean, I spent almost 3 decades in the business world. I had 3,000 employees at one point in time. I had to wake up every morning deciding, making decisions on how I can make sure that their livelihoods were maintained, and I relied on people to help me do that, just like we rely on your organization. And I think that's important. But what you and I talked about in our meeting was the biggest concern I have is that in the business world, you make a decision and then you look back and see where you failed or where you didn't fail. And my concerns has always been with the CBO is that you do a lot of good work and you put out a plan, but then we never go back and look at where we made a mistake and how we can correct it. Because it's easy to say this is what's going to happen, and I realize it's difficult for you because as you make those decisions, you're moving on to another issue and another issue. But at the same time, I think it would be best for members, especially in the Budget Committee, to realize that some of your decisions are right, some of your decisions are wrong, where you made your mistakes, where you made your failures, where you were right, and so that we can learn better. So I'm hoping that at some point in time, we can talk a little bit about how that transparency can be better informed for us, because I still don't know how you do that, and I'm still, every time we do have mistakes, can you kind of talk about how you're going to change that transparency? Sure. I know we talked a little bit about that.
Well, one of the things that we've actually done this past year, we actually produced a report that looked at how we've estimated outlays, how accurate we've been after outlays. So, for example, between 1984 and now, our estimates of outlays were off by about 1.7% on average within the first budget year. And over 6 years, we're off by about 3 percentage points. So that gives you an idea of when we make an estimate, on average, that's how far we're off, up or down. You know, it's hard to say whether that's good or bad. We'd like it to be 0, but that's a pretty good comprehensive look. It gets hard when you look at individual pieces of legislation because they wind up being thrown into a bigger budget category. You can't always follow them. But we're doing that sort of thing. We did a pretty careful estimate, pretty careful report on how we did on the coverage estimates under the ACA. not just coverage, excuse me, the budget estimates on the ACA. So that's something to actually look forward to, because there's been a lot of focus on that. So we went back and did a nice, I think, nice objective look about how we did and how others did.
Sure. Problem is 1 or 2% on a $3.5 trillion budget is a big number in many cases.
Yes.
So I look at those dollars as well. I know that the Social Security trustee report and the CBO differs on Social Security, the trust fund, and the shortfall. Can you tell me,
Sure.
you know, why there's differences there and how you're reconciling that out? Because as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, I'm very concerned about Social Security. I'm very concerned about the shortfalls and the outlays. But we also have two reports that differ.
Well, we actually had a hearing a little while back that was really helpful for us to understand how Social Security comes up with its numbers, and we talked to them about how we came up with our numbers. And I'm hoping that after we produce our next long-run budget outlook, that we go back to compare ourselves a little bit to the Social Security folks. The biggest difference starts with their economic assumptions, which are sort of basic. We do have some differences there, some differences in labor force, but then there's some other things like mortality rates and that sort of thing where we have some differences. But we did write up a report that has some of the details of where we differ, and I'd like to update that.
So you would admit, though, because I know I talked to you a little bit about your predecessor, I have the CARES Act out there, which I had outsiders do kind of a preparation of the cost differences, and Cbo scores it different than my outsider scored it. And when I met with Cbo, I really did just get a learning model for myself, and it was simple math. It was the differences in the, Cbo was saying, well, this is what we believe, and my outsiders were saying, this is what I believe. You admit that we could have those differences on anything, on any issue, right? So
That's right.
that's why the transparency is so important.
Sure.
I appreciate it. Again, I yield back, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Renacci. Next to Florida, Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your ascendancy. It's good to see a fellow appropriator leading this committee. And Director Hall, it's good to be with you. I just, for a little historical context for some of my colleagues, you may know that I was the chair and ranking member of the Legislative Branch Appropriations Subcommittee for 10 years. In that role, I was responsible in part for the oversight of CBO's budget. And we spent a lot of time working with your predecessors to make sure that CBO had exactly what you said you needed in terms of expertise, in terms of the staffing levels, so that you could really do as an objective and expert analysis of all the workload that you have. And that's something that Congress has endeavored to continue to make sure you have, because if you are hamstrung by not having enough staff, then there's a concern. And I've had CBO analyses I've agreed with, some that I've disagreed with. In fact, I remember when you came before us for the first time and you were appointed by Speaker Ryan, I believe, and you worked in the George W. Bush administration, and you subscribed to the idea of the practice of dynamic scoring, which is an analytic process with which I disagree. Yet I don't malign you and your staff's analyses, even when I disagree with them. Facts can be annoying, especially when they're presented to you and they don't line up with your beliefs. But we're in a world of alternative facts, and so to me it's absolutely essential that we have CBO's objective analysis in the majority and the minority so that we can at least have some objective facts. With that predicate, I want to just ask you, under your leadership, do you feel like, given who you worked for previously, who you were appointed by, that CBO or that members of Congress should read bias into your analysis that are generated by unduly favorable projections or unfavorable projections of the likely effects of Republican policy proposals?
I have about 25 years of managing policy analysis, policy research. I've worked with a lot of very great technical people who are professional and do their work objectively. CBO is at the top of that. They're just outstanding, the people. They're very, very professional. We do a really good job. We've always done a really good job of hiring very capable professional people. And the culture there is very strong to try to do objective work and get all sorts of viewpoints and try very hard to be objective about things. We have value because we're credible. And that's why I've been particularly bothered about the efforts to sort of attack our credibility, because we spend so much time trying to be objective and impartial and do our work middle of the road, and always have. I think again, with people who are really familiar with us, I think we have a very strong reputation for doing nonpartisan work.
Thank you. And please send our best wishes and support and thanks to the folks that work for CBO. You work excruciatingly long hours. I've had many conversations with 2 or 3 directors before you, and your work is really second to none, whether I agree with it or not. And I'll again stress that you are currently using a practice of dynamic scoring with which I and most Democrats don't agree. And yet we still have faith in your analysis. Before I run out of time, I just want to ask a question that's more granular. In the 2014 long-term budget outlook, CBO projected that with the continuation of current policy, the life expectancy gap between those with high incomes and those with low incomes will continue to grow. Director Hall, is there any reason for us to believe that this projection was erroneous, and that an improved CBO organizational and operational structure would have resulted in a more, which is the subject of today's hearing, would have resulted in a more accurate projection?
Well, that gap in the life expectancy is something we've certainly seen in the literature and in the data. And we are actively researching that a bit to see that we get it right in our forecast. Because that's an important part of our long-term forecast.
Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Arrington from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to serving under your leadership, and congratulations on your appointment. Dr. Hall, thank you for your service to this committee and to our country. The topic, as I understood it, was organizational and operational in nature, and so I'm going to be a little boring in my series of operational questions, but just because they may be boring doesn't mean they're not extremely important. So let me start with the Peter Drucker sort of philosophical question. And let me ask you if you subscribe to this. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Do you subscribe to that?
Yes, actually, developing metrics about how we're doing is very important.
How do you measure success in your organization for the work that you do and for the people you manage? Just succinctly, if you could, please.
Sure. A part of it is judging the quality of the end product. Everything that comes out of CBO has my signature on it. We have a very strong review process. We want to be comfortable with it. And we now do some things. We're going to try to do more things to assess how we've done. I mentioned the report looking about how we've done in projecting outlays. We've done on revenues. We do one on economic
Would you say quality? And pardon me for interrupting, sure. But just to be more specific, when you're talking about quality, do you mean accuracy, impartiality? Would those two be at the top of the list of quality?
Yes.
How do you measure accuracy? Do you go back and look at what you projected, what you estimated, and then within a margin of error that's reasonable, how far you hit the target or how far away from the target you were?
Yeah, that's right, we do. And one of the things that we do, we've done privately for years, which I think there's been an increased interest in, we may start to make public. Once a year we do what's called an analysis of actuals, where we get down into all the small budget categories and see now how do we predict those numbers this past year and what was the actual number. And we have an analyst go through that, and we've always done this, and talk about where they were off, where they weren't off, and that is part of how we judge their performance.
I commend you for that exercise. I think that's, I'm comforted to know you do that. So do you have like a success rate on your timeliness, success rate on your accuracy, success rate on impartiality, or something, whatever the metrics are? Do you have that, and could I look at that? To see how often you're hitting the target, and so we can work together to make improvements. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it.
Right. Yeah, I can see what we have, but one of the things that we're really hampered by is pieces of proposed legislation are such a small part of budget categories that once we make an estimate, quite often we have no idea how it actually worked out because the data is just not there to do that. So one of the things that we try to do is try to do more of that individual analysis, but a lot of it is we just can't do it.
You mentioned, thank you for all that. Let me jump to culture. I'm big on culture. I think it has a tremendous impact on your success and outcomes, desired outcomes. You said you had a strong culture. Where's your weakness? Where culturally can you improve? And just be very transparent about that. Be helpful to us.
I think one of the most complicated things we do is this sort of trade-off. When we're under really severe time pressure, we have to decide what's a good high-quality analysis and try to hold to that. And so sometimes it's this real trade-off between feeling like we got a high enough quality, we're comfortable enough with an estimate, and frankly being leaned on sometimes pretty hard by committee staff. Hurry, hurry, hurry. And now we're throwing in this transparency part, and that's another third area. And that's a really tough trio of things to manage.
Let me just run through this list. Thank you for answering the question. Are y'all unionized? Okay. Nope, no union members. What are you doing now from a sort of product standpoint or line of business that you weren't doing in your stated mission in 1974? That is, right. What are you doing additionally to what you've been authorized to do in terms of products?
Well, the biggest single thing is the technical assistance we provide. We spend more time offering technical assistance, talking with committee staff, giving them little estimates of what proposed legislation. We spend way more time on that probably than we do on our formal cost estimates. And I think that's a difficult thing, right? Because there's no output for that except I hope that committees find it valuable because they spend a lot of time asking these technical questions. That's a real difference from the old days, and a lot of that is because legislation gets to be so complicated and complex.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. My time's expired. I'll follow up with the rest of my questions. And okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Let's go now to Ms. Jayapal from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Hall, for being with us. I want to just echo how important we know the Congressional Budget Office is, and thank you and your staff. I do share the concerns of some of my colleagues that we are operating in an increasingly partisan environment where actual institutions are being undermined. And you mentioned some of the accusations of bias, and I think, I found several statements. OMB Director Mick Mulvaney, who questioned the analysis of a version of the Aca Repeal bill last June and said if the same person is doing the score of undoing Obamacare who did the scoring of Obamacare in the first place, my guess is that there is probably some sort of bias in favor of a government mandate. And then last year, the White House tweeted that the CBO continues to prove its model simply can't be trusted to accurately predict the outcomes of important health care legislation. I want to give you a chance to respond to those charges once again, but also just say that I think it's important to recognize, with all due respect to my friend from Georgia, who was commenting on Ms. Lee's questioning, that there is a difference between what the office does, what the Congressional Budget Office does, and how members choose to use it, use the results of that. And we all understand that we have different perspectives, different political philosophies. We may use the numbers that you come up with in different ways. We may believe different conclusions can be drawn from those numbers. But your job, as I understand it, is to provide us with the numbers of any proposed legislation. So I want to give you just a quick minute to respond again to the charges of bias against the agency. And while you do that, please tell us if your staff are career or appointed, so that the public, and explain to the public that might be watching what that means to be career staff.
Well, first of all, we hire people at CBO purely on their technical abilities. We don't ask anybody about their politics or their views in anything. fact, we try very hard to avoid that. And part of our process is, I've worked for many, many years in the executive branch where I helped hire lots of people who were very technical, unbiased people who were able to work objectively. We go even a little further, and it's part of the culture. We'll actually go back and look at some of the places where some of our employees worked. And if they've been in political jobs relatively lately, we don't hire them. We check their social media. If they post a lot of things that would be inappropriate for someone at CBO to post, then it puts doubt as to whether they can work objectively. So that part's really important to us. And then, we don't just throw analysts out there by themselves. We have a review process that involves lots of people. Ultimately, the director is responsible for all the work at CBO. And I think the CBO has processes in place, and we try very hard to make sure that that we're objective and it works like that. And frankly, if there were signs of someone being objective in their work, not being objective in their work, that would be a problem. That would be against CBO policy. And we're like congressional offices. People work at the pleasure of the director.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let me talk about the importance of the CBO score. My colleague, Mr. Higgins, and I introduced a bill to say that for major legislation, we should have a CBO score before it goes to the floor. Tell us what members of Congress miss when we don't have a CBO score in front of us as we're evaluating a major piece of legislation like health care or taxes.
Well, I think one of the most important and underrated things that we do is we describe the legislation very carefully and in detail about what exactly it does. And if you've ever looked at that actual text and then read a CBO, you can tell there's a lot of work there. Just describe exactly what it does and what it involves and what's impacted. I think that's a real help right off the bat, in addition, of course, to this thing going further and trying to look at the effects on the budget.
Thank you. And let me just end by asking if there's anything you want to say on the recent tax bill and how you built that, all the wide-ranging impacts into your baseline. You only have about 30 seconds left.
Sure. Well, the estimate of the tax bill itself was done by the Joint Committee on Taxation. We're required to take their estimate. But now we're going to work it into our own economic and budget forecast, and we've been doing that. We normally would close our economic forecast in early December. It's still open. I think we're going to close it by Friday, hopefully, and it will include the full economic impact of the tax bill, and then on top of that, we're now going to overlay the budgetary impact. So it'll be fully scored, in a sense, in our baseline.
Thank you so much, Director, and I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we go to the former distinguished chair of this wonderful committee, gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Black.
Well, I congratulate my friend, my colleague, and my classmate on your new role as the budget chair, and I wish you the best of luck, and I will certainly be a team player with you. I also want to thank you, Mr. Hall, and all of your members of your staff for the hard work they do. I know as the budget chair and also being on the Ways and Means Committee, the many, many hours that you all spend, and you have a very dedicated staff. However, I think it is good and healthy for us to have these hearings, and I don't want to have this hearing to go away with the title in the newspaper saying that we are picking on or totally disagreeing with the Congressional Budget Office, but I think it's healthy for us to have a discussion, and we're not talking about whether we agree or disagree, we're talking about getting it right. I mean, that's really what we want to do, because honestly, we have to set policies, and those policies that we think are good, and we get a score back that we don't necessarily think is an accurate score is difficult for us. So when we look at some of those scores, you know, they are off a little bit. I know the economic forecast of the CBO was growth somewhere between 1.6 and 1.9, and the growth this year was 2.3, and we had 2 quarters of over 3% or over. So we know that there are going to be some differences there. But where I want to go, and it concerns me the most, and I don't really know that I understand exactly how you get these assumptions. The economic models are numbers, so they're a little easier to do. But when you get into behavioral assumptions is where I have the question. Because I have seen on more than one occasion an estimate come out from CBO where I don't agree with the assumptions that they're making on the behavioral side. So, for instance, on that was one of the bills that I had about making sure that our dollars under Title X would, first of all, go to those organizations that don't provide abortions. And there was an assumption that if we did that, then perhaps those organizations that do provide abortions would close down, and then we would have X number more pregnancies, and those pregnancies would result with more children being on Medicaid. Well, I have a real problem with the assumption that if one provider closes, that women aren't intelligent enough to go to another provider to get the services of birth control. And in addition to that, that the children that would be born as a result of those additional pregnancies would necessarily all go on Medicaid. So the number was so high on that of what the cost would be that the policy then is difficult because we have to pay for it. And that's where I really have a problem, is how we get to these assumptions that are behavioral assumptions. So if you can talk just briefly about that, I would really appreciate it.
Sure. We try very hard to see what sort of economic literature there is, what sort of literature there is on how these things are working, what's likely to happen, what sort of data is available. On things like what you're describing, it can be really hard to make an estimate. But we do as thorough a job as we can. You know, when we're looking at the healthcare providers, you know, how many are in regions where they're the only provider, how many are in regions where they're not. One of the things I think that would be always helpful, especially if it's something you don't agree with, is we love the opportunity to come in and tell you how we got our numbers and how it happened. And to be honest, if you feel like we're missing something, if there's some research literature that we didn't see, we'll take a look at it.
So I thank you for that, and I appreciate that, and I hope that that message gets out to all of the colleagues here in Congress so that we can have more of that dialogue. And that gets to my second point, is about transparency. I think that that we have to look at a way that the members of Congress can get more transparency from the CBO to make sure that we are looking at what you're deciding and what we think is not exactly accurate, and have that dialogue. So I would say one thing I continue to hear from my colleagues, and I've even heard it from my colleagues across the aisle, that they would like to see how you got to where you got to. And sometimes you can just say, once you see the information, oh, okay, I agree with that more. But we have got to have an environment here where when we're making decisions and policies that affect the people, not only in our own states and our own districts, but across the entire country, that we have full transparency. And that probably is a dialogue that we need to have more conversation on, Mr. Chairman. And I know that as you move forward on additional hearings, that may be also something that's talked about a little bit more. But many times you can accept what it is that someone's saying or have that argument if we at least have the transparency. And with that, I am right on time, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Black. To California, Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you, Dr. Hall, for your testimony today, and thank you for the objective, nonpartisan analysis that you provide our committee. The recent tax bill made substantial changes to the tax code that will have wide-ranging impacts on the budget and the economy. Can you walk us through how you build that into your baseline?
Well, sure. It starts, of course, with the economic forecast, and it's a lot of a walk through all the details of the bill. You know, of course, JCT did the estimate on the legislation, but we're tasked with putting our own estimate into our baseline. We have spent weeks and weeks already going through the tax bill and working through how we think it's going to affect the economic forecast, and preparing then for the budget side of things. Once we get an economic forecast, then we have the budget forecast on it. There are just so many steps on it, but we have a bunch of really dedicated people. We have a really good tax group in there, and we're going to try to produce something that's understandable and as accurate as possible.
Do you ever have third-party outside people that look over your analysis?
Absolutely. We have a very good panel of economic advisors, and they meet twice a year. They actually sort of approve our economic forecast for us. We actually make a presentation to them. They'll make comments, and they're a diverse group. And whether they realize it or not, when they volunteer to be on the panel, they give us their phone numbers, and we call them up, and we'll have discussions with them on aspects of the analysis of the forecast that we're unsure of.
And how do you go about selecting those advisors?
Well, we've gotten, if you sort of look at our panel, it's up on our website. We have a panel of very, very impressive people from different schools, and we actually make an effort of people who have sort of a diverse background with respect possibly to politics. I don't want to, we try to avoid that part of it. We try to get people who have different points of view, certainly, on some of the things that we have to deal with.
Have you ever gotten any criticism or objection from anybody on this committee about any of those advisors?
I'm not sure about this committee. I think not during my time. I don't know. We've been pretty transparent about who they are and that sort of thing, but I haven't heard anything.
Thank you. What is the CBO's best estimate of the impact of the recent tax bill on the deficit? I understand it's $1.5 trillion.
Well, that was JCT's estimate. We are in the process right now of working through our estimate. It will be a little while before it comes out in our budget outlook.
So
it will be there.
So you don't have an estimate to date?
No, I don't.
Okay. Do you know if the estimate that JCT has put out there includes the compound interest over the next 10 years?
I think we did a version of that included the interest.
And what is that version number that you came out with?
I'd have to get back with you. It added a little bit more to it from the deficit, but I don't remember right offhand. I should know, but
I believe the number was 2.3 trillion, but I appreciate you getting me that information later.
Okay, I'll be happy to follow up.
Thank you very much. I yield my time. Back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Carvajal. Let's go to Minnesota. Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations. Looking forward to working with you. And Director Hall, thank you so much for being here. I'm a little perplexed at the other side of the aisle's hand-wringing over dynamic scoring. It's only a model about a century old, and Alfred Marshall came up with supply and demand curves. I don't think anybody doubts the elasticity of work savings and investment. We saw that reaction in the 20s when we had tax policy changes, in the 60s, in the 80s. I think we're seeing it now. But if you were to ask anyone on this panel if they wanted to reduce smoking, which we all want to do for our young people, what's the first thing they'd do? They'd raise the cigarette tax. Well, but prices don't have any effect on people's behavior. Well, of course they do. And so I understand you've got a very tough job. If I could predict interest rates or the Super Bowl winner, I'd be in a different line of work. But the bottom line is there are things that we can predict with historical accuracy. I understand you have a very tough job. As I say, monetary policy is something that you have no control over and would have to be a problem for some of your models. But let's get back to the baseline you issued last year of 1.9% growth, if we may. The Atlanta Fed now today came out with their first quarter estimate of 4.2% GDP growth. You mentioned in your analysis and today that you had concerns over the labor supply. But as we all know, the GDP, economic growth, is made up of two principal parts, productivity and people. Either one goes up, you're going to get more economic growth. Did you take into account, from an historical perspective, the increases of productivity when there is more capital invested, when there's more incentive to invest capital, and why you're sticking with 1.9%, or at least a year ago, we'll see this year, but 1.9% growth when we're clearly seeing faster growth, at least right now?
Yeah, well, I can say the productivity has been really slow, but we do actually have in our long-term forecast productivity getting back to its historical levels, something like 1.3 to 1.4%. So actually, that is in part of what's baked into that long-term growth. It's why it really is that labor supply part.
Then how would you account for the increases in GDP growth in the last few quarters?
Well, part of what's happened in the last few quarters has been a number of things. Part of it has probably been anticipation of the tax bill. Part of it is probably demand side because we're getting stimulus. And we still think there's been some slack in the economy, so there's room for sort of demand stimulus, and that's clearly a bit of what's going on.
That's really an interesting point you make. I'm glad you did, and that's really why some of us have concerns about this. We can go through the debate over Keynesian analysis versus supply side or classical economics all day long, but we've had that experience. We had it with the stimulus package in the previous administration, and we didn't get growth. And I think some of us would like to see a little bit more supply side analysis in there and restoring productivity and growth to quote a famous economist, John Baptist, say that supply will create its own demand, and we don't need to go down this Keynesian road time and time again. And isn't that a value judgment that the CBO makes, that we're going to use demand-side analysis?
Not really, because I think certain aspects of any legislation is demand stimulus, and other aspects affect the supply side. So we don't assume at all that supply side, that labor supply and productivity is just fixed. That in fact there can be some policy things that affect that.
Do you think you have a demand-side bias?
No, I think one of our challenges is we have to work through the demand side in the near-term years, and then slip into the long-term, which is supply side, and that part's just tricky. But it is two different models, really, two different approaches.
It certainly is. It's a great debate. In 2012, you came out with the exchange coverage rates for the Affordable Care Act. And that estimate updated from 2010, you said that by 2016, you predicted, I think, around 23 million would be covered under the exchanges. Center for Medicare and Medicaid Center said 10.4 was the actual number. What happened there?
Well, the first thing that happened was the Supreme Court decision that took away the requirement that states expand Medicaid. So that threw a big kink into things. Once we corrected that, we've still been off a little bit. Let me mention a little bit of the talk about the exchange stuff, just really quickly, is a little bit of cherry picking, because the most important thing was getting the budget effect correct.
Okay, I'll catch you up. I got to go, okay. But thank you so much for being here. Looking forward to a healthy debate. I would just hope you understand that you were created by a political branch of government. You serve the political branch of government. This is a political exercise, and so we've got to get the referee to make the most accurate calls possible. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thanks to the gentleman. And reference to his remark about the Super Bowl, there is one thing you can take to the bank, and that is the Minnesota Vikings will not be winning.
That's low.
Super Bowl.
I miss Chairman Black already.
I'm going to hear from all the Minnesota people now. Mr. Higgins of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And coming from Buffalo, the Super Bowl is not a good subject. Dr. Hall, thank you very much. Just a couple of questions. And the previous speaker had talked about supply side, and these are all very fair debates that should be debated rigorously. And, supply side, trickle down, and I think the new term for all of that is dynamic scoring. And that is what the future economic impact from tax policy will be, which is, it's not an exact science, and I guess that's why it's subject to a lot of interpretation. But a couple of things that concern me, the Treasury Secretary had stated explicitly, that the tax cuts as proposed that are now in the bill, particularly the corporate tax cut, which was about 14 percentage points, but the percentage change was actually 40%. The tax cuts generally pay for themselves. Do you believe that?
I want to be really careful, because different tax changes have different effects. Some can have an effect probably on the supply side, some on the demand side.
Okay.
I think the literature, we need to look at the literature and how things have been affected going forward. And we're going to have our own estimate of, it's not an effect of just the bill, but we're going to work in the tax cuts into our economic forecast, so you sort of see how we view that particular bill, how it's affecting.
Okay, well, I appreciate your cautiousness, but I would remind you that there's not a tax cut in human history that has ever paid for itself, not once, ever. The best literature in that area comes from Harvard and Yale economists, who say that best case scenario that you could recapture in economic growth about 30 cents for every dollar in tax cut. And I would challenge you to challenge me as to whether the literature says anything differently. But let me move on. The White House Council of Economic Advisors came out with a report saying that the corporate tax cut would result in increasing annual household income. I'm not talking about a one-time bonus, but annual household income of between $4,000 and $9,000. Do you believe that?
I haven't read that report, but I can tell you we will have our own analysis, independent analysis of the effects of that.
But you're familiar with that report?
I'm not really, to be honest.
You're not familiar with that report? Everybody in America is familiar with that report. That has a direct impact on the federal budget. Because if you increase household income, that increases aggregate demand in an economy. Where aggregate demand is increased in an economy, that increases employment. As head of the Congressional Budget Office, this issue has been discussed, debated in various publications over the last 6 months. I'm shocked that you've never heard of that.
I can tell you in a few months' time we will have our own analysis and our own view of that, and we'll be very careful to explain why we've come up with whatever estimate we come up with.
Okay. Just switching topics, infrastructure investment. I think the President will talk a little bit about tonight, presumably, about an American infrastructure investment of some $200 billion, which will be used to leverage somewhat of $1 trillion in infrastructure through the combination of state and local contributions in the private sector. I think all of us agree that infrastructure investment is desperately needed. But I would remind people that the $200 billion is woefully inadequate. And I would provide as an example of that is the United States deficit financed $180 billion over the last decade rebuilding the roads and bridges of Iraq and Afghanistan. Those were off budget. They're deficit financed. They add directly to the debt. So what would be the ideal infrastructure investment to really have a positive impact on job growth in the American economy?
Give the witness about 20 seconds to answer.
Okay. Really quickly, we are prepared to analyze any proposal that comes forward. We'll do it carefully and in detail. I do not want to make recommendations. We don't do that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I reel back.
Next, we go to the Keystone State, which could produce a Super Bowl winner. Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, that's one thing that we know, that Philadelphia will be there. So thank you and congratulations. Dr. Hall, I'd like to thank you for the work that you do, the work that your staff does, and I have some comments. Some of my comments have already been addressed, but I'd like to start just saying how important I think CBO is to the committee and to the budget process within the committee and within Congress, and it's important really to asserting the proper constitutional role of Congress in developing a budget. And I say that from the perspective of having served in the Pennsylvania State Senate. During my time there, initially, we had no equivalent to the CBO in the Senate. And even when negotiating with a governor of the same party, we had to rely entirely on the executive branch data in regards to decision making. And it changed the dynamic dramatically when we established the independent fiscal office of the legislative branch, similar to your role. So, yes, I disagreed with some of your analyses about health care, but we can't lose sight of the fact of the importance of the initial intent of the CBO that was laid out in 1974 and of the importance of the work that you do to what we do. I do think the effectiveness of the CBO is almost entirely dependent on its perception of members of Congress. And number one, it has to be perceived as nonpartisan. And number two, it has to be perceived as accurate as possible. I like your idea of more communication with members of Congress to talk about what CBO does. You said you come to congressional offices at their request at any time. But I think an important role, what you should see as part of your role, is to continue to talk about what you do and the importance of what you do. Is that part of your strategic plan at all?
Yes. You see, the only time I think I shy away from that is I don't want to talk about legislation that's being debated. I don't want to get involved in the political process, but otherwise, yes, absolutely.
Have you ever brought members to your facility to show the operations? I think
yes,
and be something I'd like to do at some point.
You're welcome to come over.
We've talked about the partisan. There's been a lot of discussion about the importance of being nonpartisan. I think it's equally important that we can believe that we have the best thinking out there in regards to policies that, or in regards to your analyses. And we know that predicting is tough, and it reminds me of a quote that's often been attributed to Mark Twain when he said, "Predicting is difficult, particularly about the future." But I guess in terms of experts that you bring in, could you characterize to me what you look for? Are you looking for the best thinking in the country? Would you say that the group you have really does provide some of the best experts in terms of policies that we're looking at?
Absolutely, I do. I think we get people who are very smart and very capable, who have a lot of technical skills, and part of how we get them is because we work for Congress. They feel like they can make a difference by helping inform Congress that we have an important job. And one of the things I think is underrated is we spend a lot of time, our folks, keeping in touch with experts around the country. So we have a really good understanding.
How do you choose those experts?
Well, part of it starts with our panel of economic advisors. We have a really good panel. They're all very well, smart, connected people. And we do a lot of calling and saying, well, here's a topic we're concerned about. Who should we talk to? And we make an effort to get some opposing views. If you look at some of our analytical research reports that we put out, you'll see us list the names of the people who reviewed it. We treat it like it's a journal article. So we try very hard to sort of multiply ourselves and use research.
I'm running out of time, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. I have a number of other questions, but one that I really wanted to get to was, it was CBO was first put into place 43 years ago. What can we? I think we should look at the entire Budget Act of 1974 and update it and improve it. As a part of that, how can we ensure CBO is more effective, more efficient in its operations? You can't answer that now, I don't think, but I'd love to hear from you at some point about whether you had specific ideas or specific recommendations for updating the Act and improving your operations.
Sure.
Thank you.
Ms. Schakowsky from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to associate myself with the comments and the questions of Mr. Smucker. We're all interested in CBO being able to do the best job. And I want to thank you for the work that you do and associate myself with all the thank yous that we have made. After the passage of the Republican tax bill in December, CBO revised its cost estimate for the expenditures for the Children's Health Insurance Program. In fact, the new estimate showed that reauthorizing CHIP for 10 years would save the government about $6 billion. So why did passage of the GOP tax bill change the CBO score for CHIP so dramatically?
Well, the elimination of the mandate had an effect, and one of the short versions is the elimination of the mandate, we think, will raise the average premiums in exchanges. And since if children aren't covered under CHIP, they're likely to be covered in exchanges or through Medicaid, then it'll cost the government more by having children covered that way as opposed to CHIP directly.
So essentially, the CHIP savings are a side effect of the increased costs that Americans are going to face due to the Republican effort to undermine the Affordable Care Act.
I wouldn't word it that way, but it is an effect of the mandate.
Eliminating the mandate. CBO looked at the effect of repealing the individual mandate on the number of uninsured Americans and premium costs. What did the CBO estimate?
We estimate that after 10 years, the number of people covered with insurance will be down by about 13 million people relative to the baseline, and that premiums would be about, in exchanges, be about 10% higher at the end of that time period.
And what about the administration's decision to end cost sharing, reduction payments, the ACA outreach budget by 90%? Allow work requirements for Medicaid. Were those part of that calculation as well?
No. We've treated the cost sharing reductions as an entitlement. So at least so far, until we get other direction from the Budget Committee. So since it's an entitlement, it wasn't affected.
Beyond the tax bill, how does the CBO account for administrative action that change implementation of the ACA? Is that a consideration as well?
It is, and that's one of the more difficult things sometimes to estimate. That certainly was with the ACA, because there was a great deal that had to be done to implement the ACA, and we had to make some assumptions about how it would be implemented, how well it would be implemented, and clearly some of that didn't happen so well. And so we update every year. We update our estimate of the operations of the exchanges and that sort of thing to try to take that into account.
So was there consideration of the fact that there was a reduction in the amount of publicity, of telling people about it, a shortening of the enrollment period? Was that, part of the calculation?
It will be. It's been a little while since we updated it. We'll probably do that this spring. We'll talk about that and see if we think that's having some really solid impact that we can measure.
Thank you. Is the CBO updating scores of other health legislation following the passage of the tax bill and the CHIP reauthorization?
Yeah, there are some proposals out there. We would, if we're working on anything, it might be technical assistance, in which case I can't talk about it. But if we're asked to update any of those by the Committee of Jurisdiction, we'll do an update on those.
So you initiate, or are you always responsive to inquiries from the Congress?
We don't initiate very much at all. We respond.
And that goes for the administration as well, or is it? No, I'm talking about looking into acts of the administration, executive orders, et cetera.
Sure. Yeah, no, we do certainly every year we go down and look to see if there's been some changes in implementation, whether it's executive orders or et cetera, that are going to have a big enough impact to change our baseline, and we will change our baseline if we see those. And we'll try to detail it in our budget outlook report.
I appreciate your work, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Schakowsky. Let's go now to Georgia. Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hall, thank you, and I want to thank you for taking time to come to my office. I have taken you up on that offer, and I would encourage other members of the committee to spend some time with you and your staff in their offices or in your office, really talking about the process. And I want to thank you for the direct and candid responses that you gave me. I found it helpful and look forward to continuing that. One of the things I want to I want to get back to process here. If you could go back and pick a 5-year window in the budget process, okay? And it doesn't matter to me where it is. Let's go back 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. And look at the estimates that you made in year one and what they actually turned out to be 10 years later. And do that to the second year and go out another 10 years and third year and all the way out year 5. Right. What's the accuracy at the 10-year mark when we're making a decision on budget
we're making it on this 10-year budget window. Okay, so if you go back historically, what's the accuracy at 10 years from the date that this budget committee acted on those recommendations, those assumptions?
Yeah, just this past year, we looked at our record for estimating outlays, and it's in kind of broadish categories, but it gives you an idea of the average error. We looked at it at the budget year. And then we looked at it 6 years down the road rather than 10 years down the road. But after 6 years, our average error was about 3%.
3%?
3%.
Okay.
So of course, that means for individual smaller parts, some could be higher, some could be lower, but they averaged out to be about 3% error.
Yet we're making decisions on a 10-year window.
Right.
Okay, which is where it becomes harder and harder the further you go out to predict, correct?
Right. Yeah. I mean, maybe when we update this report, we'll consider trying to do it for a little bit longer.
And let me say, I would encourage you to do that because I think it's important. If we're going to make decisions based on a 10-year assumption, it does us very little good to only have 6 years worth of historical data. I mean, that's kind of a we're missing a significant portion of the equation in doing that. So when you look at it, and you look at the results during that window. What tools do you need to get to close that gap so that you can become, because 3% may not sound like a big number, but when you've got a $4 trillion budget hanging around, that's a pretty big number.
Right.
So what do you need to be more accurate in that?
That's a good question because we have a lot of challenges. One of which is that we just have so much more work than we can handle, but that's not really an issue of being able to just throw resources at it because we suffer from a real peak load problem, right? When healthcare gets popular, our poor healthcare, well, not our healthcare people, they're not poor because they get energized by this. They're working full time.
So can you talk very briefly about maybe developing, or should we consider developing a new model for scoring that maybe, we're in this debate right now, demand side versus supply side. You've heard it here today. But, do we need to look more at what the private sector does to predict, using predictive algorithms to anticipate changing consumer behavior? I think the private sector does that in a very, very effective way. And should we look at doing that more here, or your office do that more to give us a better outlook?
We certainly could. We really do look to research, and we do try to talk to private sector folks. So we can continue to make an effort to sort of see how we can improve our accuracy by talking with other people like the private sector who does similar sort of work.
I think it would be important that we look at two things I want to push on this. Again, I think we need to look at the 10-year accuracy. Okay, if we're going to operate in a 10-year budget window, we need that 10-year data out there. I think that's pretty important because we need to see what those outlying years are actually like, and then to look at look at different modeling programs that use predictive algorithms to look at consumer behavior and how that may change these budget outlooks. The final question that I want to ask you, it's something that when the gentleman from Pennsylvania spoke, Mr. Smucker, and he was asking about your hiring process, and you said. We try to get people with opposing views. Define the view and the opposing view.
Sure. And by that, I don't mean in our hiring, but in our consultations with folks. If it's a topic where we know in the literature, there's some debate in the literature, this has a big effect, this has a small effect, they focus on different things, that's the sort of thing we'll look at because our real goal is to sort of try to represent the state of research on a topic. And, sometimes there's not full consensus on a research topic. So that's where we look for that sort of diversity.
So the view would be the process, the process by which you would have a demand side view and a supply side view. And I mean, I know that's kind of a broad, but that's what you're.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you. Now, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let's go now to Ohio. Mr. Johnson.
Thank
Should be noted that the ranking member has agreed to allow us to take care of the people in the queue before we go to him. So, Mr. Johnson, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And again, congratulations on your chairmanship. This is your first hearing, and I think it's a good one. Dr. Hall, I too want to echo my thanks for you and your team coming by my office and having the meeting a few weeks ago that we did. I don't really know how to frame this question that I have, but I've heard you say a couple of times in your testimony, you know, we use this model for this, we use that model for that. It seems to me that there's an element of science and an element of art in the work that you guys are doing, that there is an element of subjectivity and objectivity, some fact, some assumption and speculation. I'm a pretty simple-minded guy. Is there not a way to develop a scoring methodology that applies to everything so that members and their staffs understand? I mean, we have talked extensively here about the need for budget reforms because we've got a budgeting process that doesn't work. We've got an appropriation process that fails us year after year, not for lack of intent, but process. Seems to me it would be a lot easier to address some of our budgeting and fiscal concerns if we had more clarity and understanding around the methodology. Is there not a way to develop a methodology, the methodology, to score legislation to so that members and the American people can understand what we're potentially getting ourselves into?
We're certainly willing to talk about ideas that you have. And one of the things that we actually have coming out, I've talked about documenting models. Well, we're trying to also document our processes. We actually have a document coming out that says, here's the process we go through in creating a cost estimate. And so you see, here are all the steps, here's what we do. That's a transparency thing, so you can at least see exactly what we do and the process we undergo. And to the degree it gives you ideas on how we could do that differently or how we could articulate the results differently.
A follow-on question. You just said developing a cost estimate. A cost estimate's not the only thing that we need. I mean, we need to understand the long-term implications on the cost side, certainly, but on all of the other unintended or unplanned consequences of legislation. Right. So, how do we get to that part of it so that we have a clear picture of what legislation is going to do, not just the cost, but the long term?
I think when we do cost estimates, in fact, we were just talking about this a little bit. We have, we have accuracy. How much time do we spend with it to where we're really comfortable with the result? How much time do we have, right? You need to get it accurate. You need to have time to do it. Then we need to provide transparency. Those are three things that conflict with each other quite a lot. I always think that the more time we have on an estimate, be able to do the work and do it carefully, the better our estimate is, the more precise we can make it.
In business, you look at three factors. You look at time, your money, and quality, because you can get two of those in that pyramid, but you can't get all three of them at the same time. Higher quality is going to cost you more. It's going to take more time. If you want to cut time, you're going to sacrifice quality, or you're going to spend more money. You've mentioned a couple of times, at least I heard it once, and you just alluded to it there, taking more time. You said earlier that we have more work than you can handle. What drives that? I mean, the CBO is the organization that we go to get these things scored, and it's a critical part of what we do. And as my colleague from Georgia mentioned earlier, the politics of it is crazy in today's 24-hour-a-day news cycle. Why do you have more work than you can handle? Is it a resource problem? Is it a time problem? Is it a training problem?
10 seconds to answer.
What is it?
10 seconds.
Okay. I'd say the big issue is so little of our work is getting a piece of legislation handed to us and say, score this. So much of it is having ideas and helping committee staff think through things. What are the things that we should be thinking about in this piece of legislation? That technical assistance takes up just a ton of our time, but it seems to be really valuable. There's a reason why they come to us to help with that.
Mr. Chairman, I do yield back, and I apologize for running over. That's an issue that we've got to address, I believe, as we talk about budget reforms and oversight of CBO. There's got to be a clear understanding of the process and what they're doing, how much time they take to do it, and whether they have the resources to do it or not, because it has such serious implications to the work that we do here.
That's what the oversight hearings are about. We're going to have 3 or 4 of these, so more to come. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Rokita.
I thank the chair and congratulations. It's a great hearing. Dr. Hall, thanks for being here. I want to thank you and your staff, particularly your staff who always seem to be responsive, especially when there's a lot of things going on. I particularly remember the health care bill last year that we were able to work out some Medicaid issues, really in the fast lane on that, and I appreciate the responsiveness. Having said all that, when you talk about technical assistance, how much would you say, what percentage of your staff's work on technical assistance is given to committee staff or committees versus personal offices?
Most of it is committees.
Right.
That's absolutely true. But when we do help personal staff, it tends to be technical help. So because individual staff, they don't have, individual members, they don't have legislation that's at a committee, so it's not typically a formal estimate.
So again, what percentage of your staff's time is used with personal?
I know we'd have to look into. We probably do 350, 400 informal estimates for individual members.
I'd appreciate that in writing, just for as we go through this debate, to understand where you guys are spending your time. You talked with Mrs. Black about behavioral assumptions and how you looked at available literature, and you offered a member of Congress to submit literature if the estimate or the scoring came back and it was not what was expected or assumed or anything like that. Is there a procedure for a member of Congress to submit literature as they submit the bill for scoring to you?
I appreciate that question, because that's one of the things that we do when we get some legislation. We ask the committee staff, whoever gave it to us, is there some data you want us to look at?
Okay.
Is there some research you'd like us to see?
You are not made to wait. Members of Congress are not made to wait until we receive the scoring back.
Not. We want to be sure we look at what you're thinking of.
I appreciate that. When you talk about the economic advisors and the health advisors that you have, I want to focus on that process a little bit. You say you use these economic advisors to multiply, quote unquote, your ability to understand what's going on in the world. Is there objective methodology you use in selecting these people?
No, to be honest, it's literally a director's choice to sort of look at the makeup of the committee and think about whether we want some little strength in one area or another area, and to think about whether we have the right kind of balance.
So how do you ensure, absent any criteria or objective methodology, how you're not creating a little echo chamber for yourself or your organization?
Best I can say is we put the names of everybody up on our website. You can take a look through the panel.
Yeah, I've been looking, and honestly, while I can determine perhaps some of their natural bias or professional bias based on the organization they represent or work for, I don't know any of them personally. I have not peer-reviewed their published work. Have you, or is there any methodology or criteria that would force you to peer-review their work to ensure you have a mix of economic ideology and theory and all that sort of thing?
Absolutely. We do look through their work, and we do.
Okay, so that's what I'm asking. When I ask you if there's an objective methodology, you responded and said, hey, it's kind of a director's pick. We look to make sure that in your mind, that it looks great, but is there any objective methodology or criteria or process that your organization goes through?
Sure. Well, this is one of the reasons why we have very technically capable people working at CBO, because they keep up with literature and read the literature. And we get people on the panel, we expect them to be technically capable and to be objective in their advice on things, just like we try to be objective in our working as well. So.
Right, but you understand, sir, if you don't have an objective methodology, if you don't have a set of published criteria for how you're picking these people, you risk at least the attack, if not the reality, that you're creating an echo chamber unto yourself. And that if you're using these advisors to inform your work to members of Congress, then you might unintentionally or intentionally create a bias that might cause some of this tension we might be seeing from time to time on a given bill. So my suggestion to you would be that let's make this process more transparent. I mean, it's a great start to have at least the names of the people on a website. Let's create and agree on, in a bipartisan way, a published set of criteria or methodology that you might use to select these people, if in fact they're informing your work to such a degree.
Well, let me just be clear. I mention those folks because they help sort of keep us balanced. We make our own decisions. We make our own judgments, and we try to help inform our own judgments, but I don't want to suggest that they're making decisions for us.
Well, I'm not suggesting that in my questioning. My time is up, but the point is you brought this panel up as a way to inform your work, which I think is healthy, assuming that the panel is healthy. I yield back.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bratt, Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thank you, Dr. Hall, for being with us. I have 4 questions I want to kind of get to real quick. I used to be a liberal arts professor, and sometimes what's missing in this city is a systematic connections between pieces of knowledge. And so my friends over there, John's a nice Democrat friend. I like all of them, but they're very smart and intelligent the way they ask questions. We had the Chicago economists up here. They were asked, does the tax bill pay for itself? And the economist correctly said, no, probably doesn't. Probably pays for maybe a third, right? And then you get into current law versus current policy, also may give a third. And then the key question is, no one really cares about does the tax bill pay for itself. I care, does the economy pay for it? Do all of our policies together pay for it when you put in deregulation and some of those outcomes as well? And so that's what I find missing. And even when you score, the score is always at the federal level only. It doesn't include state and local impacts, right, which also has a huge impact. I think, state and local revenues are about 40% of federal. And so if you abstract away from this, it becomes politically misleading, even though you don't intend. You've been asked a narrow question. Does the bill itself pay for itself, or et cetera, when you score it? And so how do we get at truth in its totality to avoid the politics? And I do want a truthful outcome, right? When I'm making decisions on that question, how do you think about that quickly?
Sure. No, I think it's one of my points was we adapt to what Congress wants. If there's something different that you want that we can do, we're happy to talk with you and try to work it out. Okay.
Well, then it's on us. I mean, I'm interested in that because if you look at the Fed forecasting was just horrendous after the 2008 recession. Part of it, they were cheerleading. I don't blame them, right? But they were always rosy scenario, and it never got there, right? And there's reasons for that, but there's systematic bias for 8 years in a row. I mean, you got a problem when you can guess the direction of the error year after year after year. The second big issue that's coming our way in terms of just had the budget debate, the CSR bailouts, subsidies, et cetera. What is the assumption of CBO on the score there? Are those President Trump ended the CSR payments? How is that going to be scored? As if he's ending them or as if he's continuing them?
We've been treating it as an entitlement.
Okay.
So it's remained there in the budget unless we get direction to do something different.
Okay.
So we're assuming essentially that the money will be found somewhere because it's an entitlement.
Right, and that brings us back to the whole health care debate, and the score there, again, I just don't feel like we got a systematic account, right? In Charlottesville, we got the highest rate quotes in the country, I think $39,000 all in before a family of 4 on the individual side gets to access insurance. That's not sustainable, and so we would love your economists to say, hey, the way you're going, the economics are not sustainable for health care, in addition to showing us, the merits of technical bills. Right. And the big programs, too, Medicare, Social Security. I'll just add one other piece that's interesting to me lately. Immigration is a huge issue coming our way, right? We're all debating that. And so have you guys done any scoring on the total cost of illegal immigration yet?
No, we haven't.
I know. And so that's, how do we get these folks to preempt, right? These studies take long periods of time to do. And so, I mean, it's a major issue on the front. So that's just our, can I request that, or at what level will a request be acted on if we ask for a score?
Well, I tell you what a good starting point might be is I'd be happy to talk with our folks, and we can come in and talk to you about our take on the literature, what sort of literature is out there, what it says about immigration and the effects, and give you an idea of sort of where we see things at the moment, and then you know, whether or not you want us to do some work.
Right. And I don't want to get, you know, political and whatever, but it is pretty well known in academia, right? I came from a small liberal arts college, et cetera. And you can go around the country and look at the makeup of faculty and who they donate to and who the politics are to. If you go to Harvard and Yale and Princeton or whatever, the overwhelming political, and it's not bad. It's a free country. You can be in any party you want. But if you don't have any economists on a faculty who voted for the current president of the United States, you might call that bias. Right, in a certain sense. And so we're trying to get at, and that includes even kind of a Bernie kind of thing, right? A Bernie populist thing over on the left that ran through the country. And I'm just curious your response. How do we track that?
Let me give you an example of the challenge for us a little bit, but I think we handle it pretty well. When we looked at the effects of minimum wage, ton of literature on minimum wage. A lot of it has an agenda, a lot of it's not very good. So we did a lot of sorting through, not who the people are, but sorting through the actual research, what was good research, solid research, what wasn't, and culled that down and focused on things. So it was the actual work that we tried to focus on. And that was really what got us down to where we had somewhere to go. And I think that's sort of how I think about the people we talk to. We try to let their research speak for them.
Right. I know what's somewhat missing is the normative aspects of economics, right? We try to abstract from that and act like we're doing objective, you know, social science, when it's very hard to come by that. Am I already over?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I thought I had 28 left. All right, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for running the hearing. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Bratt, for your commentary. We have two that have joined the dais. Ms. Jackson Lee, you can be next. Are you prepared? Okay, Ms. Jackson Lee from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to your position. And Mr. Yarmouth, Ranking Member, thank you for this important hearing. To Dr. Hall, thank you so very much for your patriotic service to this nation. I was just in the Judiciary Committee voting on the need for transparency and to view something called the Nunes Memo and the underlying materials, inasmuch as my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have chosen in certain committees to issue statements without facts. Is it the role and the mission of the CBO to present whatever they present on the basis of facts?
Absolutely.
I recall being here in 1997, and in actuality, it was the budget resolution of 1997 that created the Children's Health Insurance Program. I'm not sure if you were on staff or you might be aware of that, but good things can come out of a budget resolution we've offered to save lives. But allow me for a moment just to create the atmosphere very quickly. Unlike in a dictatorship, autocracy, or monarchy where the king is law, in a constitutional democracy such as the United States, the law is king. And you can judge the soundness and health of a constitutional democracy not by the physical health or mental health of the chief magistrate, but the vitality, robustness, strength, and resilience of its critical institutions. The president began his term in office by disparaging and distrusting the intelligence community. He learned that the FBI was investigating this Russian interference with the elections and whether the Trump campaign personnel were involved. The president tried to coerce the personal allegiance of FBI Director Comey. Failing to secure that, he fired him. And Special Counsel Mueller was appointed to take and oversee the Russia-Trump investigation. The president and his Republican acolytes in Congress began a campaign that continues to this day of obstructing, disparaging, and trying to discredit. And here we are now, looking at an institution that since 1974 has, in a nonpartisan manner, done the work that it should do, and we are being disparaged, and litmus tests of who voted for whom. I would just ask a simple question. As you're looking at talented analysts, others with PhDs and masters, do you ask them to show you, first of all, the voter registration card?
Absolutely not.
And then, since we don't really have registration parties, or at least they're not in my state in Texas, do you ask them what political party they're in?
We do not.
As you continue your discussion to oversee the ballots, the work that you do, and I assume teams are called together of expertise and they're analyzing, in that discussion, do you ask who you voted for President of the United States?
No.
Would that be the appropriate guide in which you make your determinations for the very important work that you're doing?
Absolutely not.
So let me proceed on this. Is this a document that you have produced?
Yes.
10 things to know about the CBO.
That's right.
Number one, lawmakers created CBO to give the Congress a stronger role in budget matters. Is this a political statement?
I hope not.
Well, I mean, did you intend it to be a political statement?
No, I did not.
Number two, the Congress sets the CBO priorities. Did you intend that to be a political statement?
Not.
I ask unanimous consent to put this statement of the CBO into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Let me ask specifically points. The recent tax bill made substantial changes to the tax code that would have wide-ranging impacts on the budget and the economy. Can you walk us through how you build that into your baseline? And I know my time is short, so
sure.
Abbreviate. Let me give you this other one. And
okay.
What is CBO's best estimate of the impact of the recent tax bill on the deficit? And do you do this in a nonpartisan way? Let me, if you can remember the third question. Why would you explain why the scoring of a simple chip extension changed after enactment of the tax bill?
Sure. Okay. The process, the actual tax bill itself was scored by the Joint Committee on Taxation. We were required to take their estimate and put it into to the estimate. But when we do our baseline, which we're working on right now, we will fold in the effects of the tax bill.
May I pause you for one moment
Sure.
because of my time? Can I get that in writing?
Sure.
Would your staff remember that? So let me just jump to this question.
Okay.
Is this tax deficit going to have an impact on the budgeting process of the United States?
Do you mean the
tax bill being passed, creating a $1.4 trillion tax deficit? Is that going to create an impact? I just said impact.
Sure, sure. You know, it will likely change our forecast for the next 10 years or 30 years
And
on the
impact
budget.
government as well. So the deficit tax scam bill is going to impact it. Let me ask you this. You talked about the question of our aging population. Full employment or the opportunity for people to work increases the engine of the economy. So suppose, just speculate, dreamers were able to work or younger population. Does that drive the economy?
Sure. The effect of any of those things on the labor supply is part of our analysis.
So all of that plays into it.
Yes.
And you make the analysis fairly without any attention to political yeas or nays.
That's correct.
I thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I happily yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lee. Mr. Grothman, Wisconsin.
Thank you. Sorry, I was at a couple other meetings first, but I decided to save the best for last.
Understood.
I'll give you a couple questions kind of off the top. I don't know if this has been asked already. What time every year do you come out with your estimates as far as future revenues or past revenue or future revenue estimates?
We do our first baseline analysis typically around this time of the year. We're going to be delayed because we're working in the tax bill.
Okay. I'd like to ask you, because there's a feeling that the business optimism may have changed or attitude towards government may have changed when President Trump was elected. Could you tell us right now what the receipts were? Do you have the receipts yet for fourth quarter last year, government income tax receipts?
No, I don't think we do, but I certainly don't have them in front of me, I'm afraid.
Okay. Are they available yet?
If they are, we can get them to you.
Okay. Well, we'll go back.
They probably are. I just don't.
We'll look at the third quarter.
Okay.
Do you have the receipts for the third quarter of 2017?
I'm sure we do.
Do you know whether those were higher or lower than your estimates were for the prior year? At the time you originally came out with an estimate.
Yeah. No, I don't know offhand. We actually every quarter we do produce a little document that tells you how we are doing with the receipts.
But you don't know whether it was above or below projections?
I don't offhand. No, I'm sorry.
You know, I want to like you a lot. But that's usually a big deal. Okay, we'll switch gears. That just kind of amazes me, but we'll switch gears a little bit. You have said that you want about a, 9 to 10% increase in spending next year over last year? Is that true?
Oh, yes, yeah, that's right, that's right.
Right. And you're not alone in that.
Right.
I mean, everybody thinks the problem we have in this government is we're not spending enough money, so I'm not going to single you out for that. But you're apparently right now spending substantially more than in President Bush's last year, correct? Than 8 years ago?
I'm sure that's true.
Right. So given that substantial increase, and I always feel as things become more computerized or automated, you should require less people. But you feel you need a substantially larger staff today than 8 years ago?
That's right. We're trying to respond to congressional interest in speeding up some of our estimates and in providing more transparency. And if we're going to do that, we need more staff.
Okay, you think Congress is asking a lot more questions than they were 8 years ago? You really feel the demand for maybe it is, your demand for your services is much greater now than it was 8 years ago?
I wasn't around 8 years ago, but I'm sure it's true, actually. But a lot of the transparency stuff is just not free. You know, we have to take time to do that, and something has to give.
Okay, you right now have 233 full-time employees. Is that true? 233. And how many employees do you think you need to adequately do your job?
Well, I think we're fine adequately doing our job now, but if Congress wants more from us, we have a plan to increase our staff by only about 20 people over the next 3 years that we think will enhance.
Okay, so right now you feel you have enough people to deal with inquisitive congressmen? You're worried more about the future?
Well, let me put it this way. We since I've been in the job, we have way more work than we can do. And so we just have to prioritize things.
Okay.
And so one of the more frustrating things for me is dealing with individual members who want some of our time when at the same time we're working very hard all out on similar work for a committee. And it's just a matter of resources.
Okay. You think sometimes congressmen ask dumb questions?
No, actually, no, I don't.
Good. But in order to turn around stuff on a timely basis, you feel you need about 20 more people than you currently have? And if you were given your rather substantial increase, you would hire 20 new employees? Is that what you do with it?
That's right. But also some of it is our increasing cost of doing business for us, which includes cost of living raises for people.
Okay.
Because when we don't get money for cost of living, then we have to go down a couple of people.
Okay. Okay. Those are all the questions. I'll yield the remainder of my time. Thank you.
My thanks to the gentleman from Wisconsin. My ranking member has been very patient through this entire process, deferring his questions to the end, as I have. And I want to yield to the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's been an interesting session. I've enjoyed the conversation. So thank you, Dr. Hall, thank you for your testimony and your responses. They've been very cogent, and appreciate them. And I also want to add that I've been the beneficiary of visits from you and your team, and they're very, very valuable. I've had the pleasure of coming to your place of business, and your team is very impressive as well. First of all, I want to mention, I think it was my friend Mr. Woodall who talked about not having a sense of the bias of the leadership of the CBO. And I will say that in the, I think, 6 years that your predecessor was here when I was on the committee, I never for an instant had an idea of what his personal bias was. And I was pleased to find out after he left the position that he was pretty liberal. And I will say that I have never had one indication in listening to you or talking with you of what your personal bias may be, too. So I salute that. This is a totally rhetorical question, but have you ever done an analysis of the cost per piece of legislation enacted, the CBO cost a piece of legislation enacted?
Yeah, we haven't, in large part because it varies so much. It can be a piece of legislation changing the name of a building, or it could be something we've worked on for 18 months.
Right, and just because Mr. Grothman asked the question, in this document that you provided, it says that in 2017 you did 740 reports. Do you have any sense of how that has grown, maybe just within your tenure?
Yeah, we're probably 100 or so above. In some respects, it's a little misleading because so much of our work is that technical assistance side. That if we wrote down the instances of technical assistance, we're up to something like 10,000 of those. So
a lot of work.
Give you an idea.
A lot of work. I think it was Mr. Renacci asked you a question, and you were responding about this is going back to the ACA, the situation with the exchanges, right. And you were cut off. Would you want to continue to make that? It was an explanation of what was happening in the exchanges and how that might relate to coverage and cost.
Well, sure. Well, one of the points I certainly want to make is, while we wanted to, of course, get an estimate of the exchanges correct, more than that, we wanted to get the budget impact correct. And so we've actually written a little piece that goes through how that worked out for us. How accurate we were on the spending on the subsidies, how accurate we were on the number of people who were uncovered, and included the exchanges. So it's a bit more of a complete look at things. And then one of the real challenges, of course, especially with the ACA, implementation was such an important thing. And, we wind up, we do what we can, but we really kind of wind up assuming that implementation is going to be about average, about the same as other pieces of legislation. And that doesn't always happen.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to spend too much on healthcare, but I do want to ask one question. When we put together the ACA, one of the things that we focused on was making sure that preventive care was a significant part of the agenda. And because we believed, those of us who were involved in that preventive care ultimately has a significant benefit on the budget in reducing long-term healthcare costs. Have you ever, as the CBO, to your knowledge, ever done a score on the benefits of preventive care?
Yeah, the one that had the clearest sort of result was from cigarette tax, and the cigarette tax, there'd be revenue generated from the tax. There'd be revenues, increased revenues from better health. That had a real impact. It had an odd, in terms of spending, it had sort of an odd counter, right? Because the cigarette tax would reduce the number of smokers, and that would reduce Medicaid and Medicare spending, but then people would live longer, and that would increase government spending because they're living longer. So there was an odd thing there that sort of balanced out the spending, which is an odd part of what we do sometimes.
Right. But inside the budget window,
right.
That's probably not going to be as great an impact, I wouldn't think. But just in terms of pure preventive care, the ability to go and have checkups annually without any co-pays or so forth, has there ever been a score done on those types of initiatives?
Yeah, I can see if we've got some more examples. The tax one was just really obvious. Sometimes the preventive medicine stuff is hard because there's not as much evidence as we'd like to sort of base the analysis on.
Moving to another question, I was struck, and I've talked about this in many contexts, but the idea that when CBO puts out a number like 23 million, automatically that gets used for our political purposes, but it gets kind of in concrete in the public's mind. Has the CBO contemplated, and maybe this is a restriction we put on you, that you could create a range of estimates so that, first of all, it would narrow your error rate, but also it would not be something that is that people actually rely on for arguments when, in fact, nobody's ever going to be accurate exactly, and the range might be more useful.
Well, my starting point is it's a budget committee thing. The point estimate is used in enforcement, and so the budget committee needs a point estimate. So we try to characterize uncertainty as best we can, and sometimes we can put in ranges, but that's hard to do. And to be honest, so much uncertainty is unknown unknowns.
Are there any other, could you walk us through maybe some of the other requirements that are either in statute or otherwise that affect how you develop the baseline and score legislation relative to that baseline?
Oh yeah, there's quite a lot. I mean, it's For example, how we treat Social Security trust fund and et cetera, where we're directed to assume that that pays out rather than the trust fund cuts off benefits. When we forecast discretionary spending, we aren't really forecasting it. We just put in an inflation rate in and assume that. So most of those little rules are directed either through law or through the Budget Committee.
So that kind of goes to Mr. Bratt's comment about it's on us to actually deal with some of these. I just want to talk a little bit about something that I'm obsessed with, and that's the pace of change in society and how that complicates a lot of policy making, not to speak of your role. I remember when Secretary Geithner used to come before the committee, and one time I asked him, we were talking about 30 and 40-year projections, and I asked him how reliable he thought 30 and 40-year projections were, and he said, I don't think any projection outside of 5 years is reliable. And the pace of change in the world has only quickened since then. And I was reading the other day an interview that was done with the managing director of Mercedes-Benz, and he had some unbelievably disruptive predictions about what was going to happen in various fields, transportation, energy, education, the legal profession, within the next 10 years. And they are things that, for instance, basically the cost of electricity because of the reduction in the cost of solar power going to virtually zero. That obviously has huge implications. A reduction, actually an abolition of a huge percentage of the jobs that now exist. We know about the possibility of about 170,000 truck drivers losing their jobs imminently because of self-driving vehicles. A lot of these things are happening. And my question is that the kind of futuristic thinking that is any of that done in the CBO? You don't have any futurists on staff, but that might be helpful. We need them in Congress, I know that.
Actually, I rather like what we do. They're unknown unknowns, but we can look at things like productivity. Historically, productivity has ranged about 2 percentage points. You go back and look at labor supply. How has that ranged historically? We can then put those into our long-term forecast, and we have a point estimate, but then we can vary those important variables by how they varied in the past and give you some idea of the direction we're heading. And, of course, that doesn't tell you about the real outliers. Right. But it does give you some idea of historically how much variation we've had and what does that mean for our forecast.
Great. Well, I thank you once again for your work, your service, and your appearance here today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. I hope not to take all of my 10 minutes. I want to bring out a couple of questions. One, CBO has 9 distinct divisions. When was the last time that there was any kind of a review of the organizational structure of CBO, and how often do you assess the org structure, if you will, of the organization?
I mean, we certainly think about it. We've had a little turnover in the heads of those divisions. I think I think more than half of them have been replaced over the last 3 years because of retirements and et cetera. And when that happens, we do think about, do we have the right sort of organization? We do think about that. We haven't given any real clear thought, frankly, because I think it works pretty well. We work in teams. Our budget analysts are separate from our product area, our production, our program analysts, our program folks. A lot of what we try to focus on, more so I think than the organization, is trying to make sure that they coordinate better, they work better together. Sometimes our budget analysts are really different than our PhD economists, and we need to make sure that they listen to each other and work together, because there's a tendency for them to be apart, and that's probably a function of our organization.
But you're not afraid to get outside the box?
No, not at all.
Okay. Just a couple of words about Joint Committee on Taxation. Do you guys have and I realize they're on the floor, I guess right above you, and they're probably watching, so you got to be careful with your answer. Do you have a really good relationship with them? Is it a good collaborative relationship with them?
I think so. I think we have pretty distinct, clear roles, And they've been very patient about helping review some of our stuff. And we certainly worked well together, I thought, through the health care, because all those health care estimates involve the Joint Committee on Taxation.
From time to time, because of the makeup of your organization, are there discussions that go on between this goes back to my collaborative question. Right. Are there times when your folks in CBO might think differently about something come out of Joint Committee on Taxation, and are they free to exchange those ideas in hopes of getting a little closer to the truth as we all want to know?
I think so. I think the biggest room for improvement, frankly, is that if we were a little bit more transparent with each other. I don't think we know a ton about their model. I don't really know a ton about our model. But we do manage to work together. But I can't think of instances where we did any sort of second guessing on what they've done.
And I don't want you to speak for Joint Committee on Tax, but since the passage of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, there have been a number of companies and businesses, large and small, that have made significant decisions about how they're going to take this windfall, real or perceived, and how it's going to impact downstream the people that work for them. Bonuses, raising minimum wages, inputting more resources into retirement plans and those kinds of things. Does any of that, does the amount of that, I know there's expected to be some of that, but has the avalanche of this news coming out, has it surprised anybody in your organization, in Joint Committee on Tax?
Yeah. Well, I know we've had some discussions about it. From our look at the forecast with the tax cut in it. We've done some going back and looking to see now how consistent is this with what we've seen with the initial reaction to the tax bill. I don't think we have anything that's been dramatically different than we expected, hopefully we'll try to talk about some of that when we release our budget outlook.
And to be respectful of your time, my last question is, the UK has in their CBO equivalent, the Office of Budget Responsibility, has a process where they take certain policy issues and that they give some kind of a confidence factor to them regarding the data that is used, regarding the modeling that is used, and regarding the behavioral aspect of it, and then they give a kind of a final grade to that. Does CBO have something like that? I know you've spoken generally about how you look at your products from a confidence standpoint, but do you have anything that has a metric like that or a confidence factor built into it? And if you don't, have you considered using something like that and sharing that with the Congress?
Yeah, our confidence and our uncertainty is sort of mixed into our work, but that's an interesting idea. We have had some interactions with the British equivalent. I think it would be worth sounds like it would be worth our time to take a look at what they do and see if we can get some good ideas from them. If it's something that you all think is valuable, we'd love to figure out how to do it.
Very good. Dr. Hall, thank you for appearing before this committee today. I want to advise members they can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit questions or any extraneous material for the record may do so within 7 days. And with that, the hearing stands adjourned.